Ladies and gentlemen, our first panel for the day, Taking the Fear Out of Behavioral, is beginning now in the panel room, featuring Stephen Reeder, Steve Farnsworth, Christy Kronovacs, Jessica Conlon, moderated by Bill Treese.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to eCap West. Really appreciate you joining us today. We're excited that we're representing the West Coast. Being a West Coast guy, we're happy that eCap has finally made it out west. So great job by Hershey and his team. They always put on a great show. So I want to thank them first and foremost. We're going to do quick introductions from the panel, starting with Dr. Conlon down here on the end.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jessica Conlon. I'm the Chief Development Officer for Behavioral Health Solutions. I was an Arizona resident for about 20 years, so I'm pretty familiar with our healthcare system on the Medicaid side, outpatient, and now long-term care. I'm happy to be here to see you all.
Hello, I'm Dr. Christy Kovacs. I am a clinical psychologist. I am the Executive Program Director and co-founder of Behavioral Health Solutions, and have been here since the beginning and focusing on long-term care residents and their care.
Hi everyone, Stephen Reeder. I am formerly from New York, lived in California for the last 14 years, and I've been in healthcare the whole way along. Been working in skilled nursing in Los Angeles for about 10 years, and for the last couple of years I've been Chief Operating Officer of facilities out in Nevada and in Arizona, specifically with dealing with behavioral health types of residents. Happy to be here.
I'm Steve Farnsworth. I'm the President and CEO of Summit Healthcare. It's a subsidiary of the Ensign Group. It's a Northwest portfolio of Utah, Idaho, Nevada, and Washington. Been in the industry for 15 years now, and great to be here with everybody.
Thank you. I'm Bill Teresi. I'm the CEO and founder of Behavioral Health Solutions, and we'll get started here. I think the intent of the panel today is really taking the fear out of behavioral, and what we want to do first is define what behavioral means. A lot of us have an image of a behavioral patient that's difficult to manage, might need a one-on-one or additional resources, but many times these behavioral residents are the folks that are in your building today. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, Dr. Kovacs.
Yes, these are the residents that you are currently taking care of. This doesn't mean you need to accept residents from state psychiatric hospitals to have a purely behavioral building. These residents are in your facilities. They can have anywhere from refusal of care, refusal of meals, refusal of psychiatric medications, which could precipitate psychiatric hospitalizations or sent to the acute. They could be smearing or throwing feces. They could have physical aggression during care, mostly dementia patients who are at late stages that are just reacting out of fear. Verbal aggression, making loud, disruptive noises or cursing, perhaps at your staff. They could be exhibiting exit-seeking behaviors, always packing their bags and trying to get out of the facility. A lot of attention-seeking. We see making false accusations against staff, maybe even making 911 calls. Those are some difficult ones. Hoarding behaviors to where it gets to the point where there's causing clutter and it becomes a danger to your staff and other residents and the resident who's hoarding. Stealing, rummaging, going in other residents' rooms, and sometimes that will cause a reaction from those residents who have their own psychiatric issues. So there's all these behaviors that are currently going on in your facilities, and this is what a behavioral patient is. It doesn't mean that psychiatric patient that just came from the state hospital and is having everyday hallucinations and is screaming and freaking out and trying to get out a window. It can be anybody, even those patients that have substance use disorder that are trying to hoard alcohol in their rooms or whatever it may be. But you are already taking care of these residents.
Thank you, Dr. Kovacs. So Behavioral Health Solutions today services approximately 250 nursing homes in 7 states. We provide psychiatric service, therapy. We also administrate government programs or payer programs that are directed at SNF that incentivize buildings to take on behaviorally acute residents. So we're going to talk a little bit about those programs today. I'm going to turn over to Dr. Conlon, talk a little bit about the occupancy in the facilities.
So if y'all see the slides on either side here, I think everyone's pretty familiar with where census was in long-term care facilities prior to COVID, and of course you see that dip there due to the significant losses. And then you see in January 2021, when the vaccine was implemented, that's when we start to see our census increase. And so one of the things we're here to talk about today is how did that happen? How did we see this gradual incline, which is good, so we see people coming into your homes, into your facilities, and receiving the care. But one of those ways is through the changing demographic or nursing homes expanding the patient demographic into who they accept into their homes in order to get us to that point.
I appreciate that, Dr. Conlon. Over the last few years, we've seen a 10% increase in the national census in our nursing homes. And many of the reasons why is we've really expanded the scale, or the scope, I should say, of residents that we're starting to take. We're starting to take more residents that have challenging behaviors, that are on multiple psychotropics, and we're starting to see CMS really clamp down on the guidelines and requirements to managing these types of residents. Some of the long-term care facility trends that we're seeing, Dr. Kovacs?
Yeah, so we're seeing the median age of the resident increase to where the median age is 85, and at least 50% of those tend to have Alzheimer's. So you see the age increasing, and you see an increase in patients with psychiatric symptoms. So over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been 65 state psychiatric hospital closures over 22 states. And that doesn't include the IMDs, the Institutes for Mental Disease, and the residential treatment centers that house these patients. So where are they going? They're going to the streets, these what we call, if they have Medicaid, high utilizers or frequent flyers. They're bouncing out of jails, ERs, and they need a stable place to land. In some of these cases, the best way and the best lower level of care would be a nursing home where they can receive all the care they need. And the increase in these people that need this additional care and that have no other place to go has increased dramatically over the last few years due to these hospital closures.
And some of those residents that we see, or those patients that we see coming into the nursing homes, are people with traumatic brain injuries. We see that people are no longer rehabbing in hospital settings or post-stroke and things like that. So you have this kind of this middle ground where we used to keep people in hospitals. Hospitals aren't necessarily always the right standard of care. We can't have people going out onto the street. So then here you have the nursing home that becomes the right standard or level of care.
And recent studies have suggested that in your homes, over 70% of the residents have some type of psychiatric disorder. And that is just the trend in the census. And that doesn't count even those that may have not been diagnosed. Even those who come into your facilities, they've had a serious injury or catastrophic illness. They're having adjustment issues, and they're isolating. They're going to suffer from depression, anxiety, and just fear. They've lost their homes. They're in a new environment, having to deal with the realization that this is now their home. They don't have their freedom. They don't have their home any longer. And they need that additional psychiatric care to be able to come to terms with some of these changes.
And just to kind of piggyback off of that, we see that increase in grief and loss, and I think we automatically think grief or loss in the sense of losing a person, but we see it and a lot of times in our daily work in terms of loss of independence, loss of a limb, and of course you also have the loss of maybe a friend or family member, but we're seeing this magnification and kind of expansion of what does grief look like, and then along with that comes your psychiatric symptoms like the depression, anxiety, sometimes PTSD and things like that.
Yeah. In addition to, you do see your psychosis, traumatic brain injuries, intellectual disabilities, developmental disorders, a whole range, and those diagnoses are increasing as a percentage of the people in nursing homes as the census is climbing back up.
Over the last 5-10 years, we started to identify many states that have funding programs that are directed at skilled nursing facilities to take on some of these most challenging residents. For some of the cases that you're talking about, there's additional resources that are needed to care for them. In many of the states that are on the board here, there are either existing programs or programs that are being developed to help fund and care for these residents. You'll notice the Northeast and the Southeast being pretty blank. We just have not yet gotten there yet. But we're currently working on multiple programs across these states. And we're going to detail some of these programs today. But there are a lot of benefits to these types of programs that are being driven into skilled nursing today. The first benefit really is being able to partner with your local acute hospital in a much better way. There are a lot of difficult to discharge residents that we deal with that the hospitals certainly want to move on to the nursing homes. Nursing homes become much more apt to take on that resident when they have the additional resources in place and they have the additional funding. Maybe you want to run through a few more of these, Christy.
Yeah, so in every state that we've come across, specifically Nevada, Washington, there was the same pain point, and that there's these residents that are difficult to discharge, and the hospitals are getting backlogged to where we've seen residents that have been in the hospital unnecessarily for over a year without some place to send them to, and they're sending them out of state. And in Nevada specifically, they were actually giving them bus tickets and sending them out of state, and we were sued by California specifically for that and developed a program to address it. But every state has this same pain point. They don't know what to do with these residents. And the nursing home isn't typically going to be accepting of admitting these residents because they don't feel they have the resources. They're concerned about the staff, and there is that fear of behavioral. But these programs, they offer the additional incentive or reimbursement to care for these residents. And then you have companies like BHS who come in behind there and can offer all the additional support, the staff training, the psychotherapy, peer support, group and individual therapy, psychiatric assessment, medication management, all of those things that may not have been available in the past to take on these residents. So it provides all those resources. And of course, if you're getting that additional reimbursement, it enables you to get better staffing or whatever resources the facility needs, in addition to having the contracted mental health support. And a program like ours, like in Nevada, where we're in providing all these services, it decreases the acute transfers. We're seeing a decrease in inpatient admissions where we've been able to provide all the wraparound care that these types of residents see. It helps to stabilize these patients that have had a history of homelessness or, protracted and frequent inpatient or ER hospitalizations, stabilize them in the lowest cost setting. And it saves the system money by doing that, from Medicaid to Medicare to just your jails, hospitals, and, it makes it easier for these hospitals, and hospital associations are definitely on board with getting these difficult to discharge patients out of the hospitals, not having to send them out of state, but having a place to send them where they can receive all the care they need and be stabilized in place.
Thank you. I think the ultimate goal here, beyond the clinical care that we provide to the residents, is an overall savings to the healthcare system. We've run some data in terms of our nursing home partners, inpatient transfers, acute transfers that have been avoided by really providing great care. I know that you had a facility in Reno where we ran some data. We started with them 4 or 5 years ago, and you saw a significant decrease in acute and inpatient transfers.
Yeah, it turned out to be close to 18% reduction in inpatient admissions for their residents from year over year, which was a savings of $320,000 for that 1 year to the system overall.
I think what we're seeing across many of the states is that there's an acknowledgement of the additional resources that are needed to take care of these residents. We just don't have one model that's being used by by a lot of states, I should say. In fact, we have very different models, and the payment is coming from a different department or from a different payer. We're also seeing different ways in which residents are qualified for the additional funding. So what we're going to do is we're just going to touch very high level on 3 of the state programs that we work with. We're very familiar with them. The first one being Nevada. which is called the BCCP. And Dr. Kovacs, if you could run through the qualifications and where the funds come from, please.
Yeah, so this is a Medicaid fee-for-service funded program, and the requirements are basically a medically based behavioral disorder, which a lot of things qualify for that, from depression to dementia to psychosis. And then we need at least 30 days of documentation. So for this particular program, it's really about getting the staff to document appropriately. So there's some behaviors that don't qualify for this program specifically, but verbal aggression, physical aggression, hoarding, rummaging, sexually inappropriate behaviors, regressive behaviors like throwing food or feces, exit seeking and wandering don't qualify for this specific program, and that's something that we're also advocating for change. But for this program funded by Medicaid, it's really about the documentation that gets these programs, gets these patients qualified and gets the additional reimbursement to the facility.
So the program in Nevada is driven through Nevada Medicaid in Arizona, and I think we'd be remiss without talking about the great state of Arizona since we're here. Dr. Conlon, I know you grew up here in the behavioral health industry, so if you could outline the program that we have.
Sure, absolutely. So the program here, we call them behavioral health units. Some of you may be familiar, but they are managed or funded essentially through the state's Medicaid or managed care plans. Typically, each managed care plan has case managers or long-term care case managers that are assigned to each facility. But what the facilities who have these BHUs do is they outline a comprehensive behavioral health program. And so in that, what they do is outline who are the residents that qualify, and typically will separate them kind of similarly to what Dr. Kovacs was describing, but separating them by behavior and severity of behavior. So they can qualify with a diagnosis, but then also they might have the wandering dementia behaviors, for example, or you might have all the way up to where they have sexually inappropriate or violent behaviors. But it's kind of up to the facility to be able to outline what each unit is going to, what type of resident or patient they will have, and then also what resources or treatment services are available in order to maintain them, or even ideally with the idea of having them step down, but of course sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes you're trying to maintain and hope that they're being successful where they are.
Thank you, Dr.
Arizona
Conlon.
is different because they have actual units that they segregate the patients into, and those units have specialized staffing, where that isn't a requirement for the Nevada program. The patients, they can separate them into specific units just so they can be focused on those units towards behaviors, but they could be staggered throughout the nursing home in any way the administration sees is appropriate.
I would say the biggest difference, let's say just between, if we were going to compare the two, is that in Nevada, you're outlining by tier the type of resident, whereas the BHUs are structured in type of unit, and then you kind of funnel your resident into the appropriate level of care within that.
We're going to move to Washington. I think Washington is a program that we're very excited about. When we entered the state of Washington, there was 3% utilization in the former program, which was the ECS, and now is the EBS. And maybe you want to walk us through that journey, Dr. Kovacs.
Yeah, so when we came into Washington, it was kind of a behavioral health desert, especially for nursing homes. There weren't a lot of companies like BHS that provided these types of services. And this program, ECS, which evolved into EBS, Expanded Behavioral Supports, is funded by Home and Community Services. And so they were really wanting to get the patients back into the community. But I think when we came on, there was a realization that some of these patients are just never going to be appropriate for discharge. And although, we try to write a discharge plan, sometimes they're going to have to be in the home for an extended period of time. So they allowed, for the first time, instead of only allowing patients to get on the program if you admitted them from the state hospital, to do conversions, which was converting their existing residents. And we found that just like in Nevada and Arizona, these patients were already there. So the homes are already taking care of these residents. They just weren't getting the resources they need. And to also to participate in the program, in this program specifically, you have to have contracted behavioral support. You have to have a company that will come in and provide the medication management, the psychiatric assessment, the psychotherapy, group therapy, peer supports, and staff training. So they allowed us to do the conversions, and they also made it a tiered program. So at first it was only EBS, and then, which was kind of your basic, and it depended on the amount of intervention you needed, the amount of resources that were needed to care for the patient. And what they passed starting July 1, 23 was another rate, a higher rate for an EBS plus patient. So even those same patients that they were taking care of that were, combative during care, or even just had behaviors on a daily basis. So it's really the frequency and degree. So from the point that we started, you weren't allowed to convert patients, and most places, most homes couldn't participate because they couldn't find the behavioral care, contracted behavioral care to care for these residents. So since we have kind of jumped off about 3 months ago, utilization has increased dramatically because we're realizing that almost every home that I've gone to and spoken with the clinical staff, and we've gone over the residents, they already exist. A huge majority have medically based behavioral disorders of one kind or another, and they had at a minimum refusal of care. Or behaviors that interrupted their ability to have a high quality of life. And so to bring in the staff training and all the additional resources, now they can utilize this program and take better care of the residents that they were already caring for.
Thank you. We're going to move to the panel discussion now, and I promise to get the operators involved here. But first, I want to ask the clinicians just on any specific challenges to the clinical management of the BHU. We're going to use BHU as our acronym today for Behavioral Health Unit, if that's okay with everyone. So any clinical challenges that you face?
I mean, there's challenges that we have as a behavioral health company. Recruiting clinicians is probably the biggest one. And that's a reason why in a lot of these states they were kind of behavioral health deserts, because it's hard to find the people. And then find the people that are passionate about working with this specific population. So finding good people and getting them in the facilities is one of our biggest challenges. Another one, and I'm sure you'll hear from the operators about staffing challenges, but it's getting buy-in from the staff and basically getting them not to fear the behavioral and providing the training and getting them to document. I think sometimes they are either too busy, short-staffed, or they normalize the behaviors. Just because Mrs. Smith does this every single day and she yells and screams and rummages, that doesn't make it normal. It's just normal for Mrs. Smith. And so they normalize the behaviors and therefore they don't document. So when you're just going through the documentation, you might think, there's no behaviors in this facility. But when you actually take a deeper dive and discuss with the staff and assess the patients, you see that all those behaviors are really occurring. So getting them to document, getting staff to document the behaviors appropriately, and getting the right people into the facilities that have the kind of empathy that we require through one of our clinicians to care for these people would be my answer.
Stephen, did you want to talk about some of the pain points in terms of operating a BHU?
Yeah, so residents with schizophrenia, bipolar, or any other major depressive disorder, they all have the risk of shortened lifespan due to comorbidities and then the rest of the population. So that presents a problem as far as census, as far as occupancy, dealing with these residents. Another thing that you're going to encounter if you have these residents is there's going to be a lot more reportables to the state. There's no way around it, So teaming up with your local ombudsman, APS, and even health department to be on the same page will go a long way for you. When it comes to, as stated before, there's no real solution here when it comes to these residents, these patients. You know, I've been in California in traditional SNFs, and there are just so many residents that are in a traditional SNF that perhaps a referral will look like that it's just totally regular, and then you're stuck with a certain type of resident that you have to deal with. That could lead to a lot of things. That could lead to increased amount of one-on-ones. A lot of hospitals try to, you know, they try to take advantage and don't accept the resident back, and then you're at a point where you're a little bit on the stuck side. So, you know, like Christy said, these residents end up going to jail. They end up going to, they end up on the street, and sometimes, you know, in the ER. But the ER, again, is temporary, right? The hospitals want them out. So they wind up in the nursing homes. So you really got to do your deep diving into it, you know. And finally, behavioral types of nursing homes. It's not, you know, not a behavioral home, but a behavioral modified nursing home. You can't just wing it. If you think that you're just going to leave on a Friday afternoon and come back on a Monday and hope everything went well, as an administrator, as a clinician, you're bound to have something. You need to put processes in place. If those processes are not being followed to the end, then you're going to have issues. And, you know, it's a real case of being proactive here. So,
Appreciate that. I know one of the biggest challenges that we had when we started BHS 7 years ago is we would go into a facility and we would talk about behavioral health coverage, and typically the staff would be afraid. The staff would, you know, there's a lot of expressions of, this is not a behavioral building, I don't want to work for a behavioral building. And we started to overcome that with education, but certainly staff retention is something that's important. And I know your organization prides themselves in staff retention and your culture. So maybe you want to speak to that a little bit, Stephen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as I'm listening to the panelists here, there's a lot going on in my mind of the direction that we could take this. But I really appreciate what you talked about, Dr. Kovacs, on kind of demystifying and taking the fear out of behavioral patients, because this just isn't a nursing home issue that we're dealing with. I mean, this is on the national stage. It's getting a lot of attention. And I think that the fear, primarily from clinicians at the local level, is I don't want to be labeled as a behavioral nursing home. And that's a real fear. It's legitimate, but I think with what you guys talked about earlier, we can kind of take that out and bring in some clarity around some of the national trends and the fact that this is a demographic issue. This just isn't a nursing home issue. And so I think education, like you talked about, Bill, is key when it comes to retention. I think that, let me back up. There was an article that I came across a few months ago from the Gallup organization, and it was a new term that they had coined in the workplace. And the term that they coined was quiet quitters. I don't know if you guys saw that article. I see a lot of heads shaking. And that was kind of a shocking term to hear, thinking, man, what in the world does that mean? And as you read through this article, in essence, what a quiet quitter is it's an employee that is not just disengaged, but actively disengaged. And that kind of takes, it to a whole new level, in my opinion, that we have. I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but it was a very high number of quiet quitters that we're working with on a daily basis that we might not even realize, we're dealing with that. And as you read through the study, the thing that stuck out to me the most, it was really odd. I wouldn't have thought in a million years that this was the reason why people are quietly quitting emotionally, employees. And in essence, it was because the owners or the leaders of these organizations were not telling the truth. And that was a pretty impactful thing to think about. And as I thought through this panel over the past couple of weeks, I thought, okay, well, what are some instances when it comes to this in our industry that we don't tell the truth? as leaders of organizations. And I think one way that we do not tell the truth, and hopefully this isn't intentionally, but we don't tell the truth sometimes in our onboarding. We hire an employee, and during the interview process, we talk to the employee about all of the ponies and rainbows cultural things that we stand for, and our mission statement and our core values and all of these really sexy things that we, theoretically do. And this employee gets jazzed up. We don't mention anything about how, C-Wing is full of behavioral patients, right? And so this employee goes through the orientation process. They get done with orientation, and their first shift is a night shift on C-Wing. Do you think the culture matches up with what they were told? Probably not. That's where we don't tell the truth. And I think we're better off if you want a higher likelihood of keeping your employees, tell the truth around the real pain points that you're facing in your building. So when they get through that orientation process and that program, they will see what you labeled for them and say, yeah, Bill was exactly right. He told me I would see this. This is exactly what I would be dealing with. So in essence, I think as leaders, when it comes to retention, we need to obsess about over the employee's experience that they're having. And it can't just be the administrator. It can't just be the director of nurses. I'm talking at the local level. It has to be an entire team obsession over their experience. I think another piece about this when it comes to behaviorals, because you guys talked about the fear again, is the clarity around what to expect and the competency around the role. And I think, Steve, you touched on this just briefly, that with COVID, even pre-COVID, I think that our behavioral approach as operators has kind of been on autopilot at best. For the most part, I think it's been reactionary. We get a patient that, surprises us from the hospital, and it's like, oh my gosh, all hands on deck. We have this reactionary approach to care. But if I could speak to the operators, the one thing that I would encourage operators to come away from this panel with is, what are you doing intentionally to be proactive to build competencies around how to handle this demographic of patient? Because it's here, it's part of the industry now. We're not going to see these isolated, BCUs and units here and there. I mean, you just talked about that. Most of these patients are in our facilities, right?
Appreciate that. For those of you that don't know, Stephen Reeder operates one of the largest BHUs in Arizona. And I know that at one point you were in survey jeopardy when you first took over operations, and you've done an excellent job navigating those waters. And I've been there for part of that journey, and the work that you've done has been incredible. And I really like to know the resources that you think, this is a two-part question, that are important to effectively running the BHU. And then maybe talk to us a little bit about the survey challenges with a BHU facility.
Just to touch a little bit on what Steve was saying as far as the retention, there's one thing, with the behavioral facilities that people are not really talking about much. We've seen with CMS the recent, staffing mandate that just came out. So, for a lot of Midwestern, perhaps, facilities, that even though 3.0 for somebody like a California operator is no big deal because their minimum is 3.5. It still does affect plenty of people, especially states that are not mandated by a federal PPD. With behavioral facilities, if you're running below a 3.0, it's probably a problem. So this is something I think that really is not really as much expounded upon as far as Indeed, different ads, and getting your name out there. That's something that definitely should be pushed. In general, PPDs are much higher in behavioral facilities, whether whether the health plans mandate it, which they do in Arizona, or in a state where it doesn't really matter as much on a federal level or on a state level, like Nevada, perhaps in Washington as well. Regarding the survey, so there's a perception that you're more likely to get a tag if you admit a behavioral type of patient, and that's simply not true. If you're prepared, if you have appropriate documentation, if you have a treatment plan, if you have a diagnosis documented well, they're very, very into the behavioral treatment plans, no matter if the resident's a wandering dementia or the resident has a cognitive, mental illness that's going on. When we took over our facility in Phoenix about a year and a half ago, I've dealt with special focus facilities before. We've actually dealt with quite a few of them in California, and we've done well. So we sort of came into a dumpster fire in Arizona, and we were sort of chastated as the stepchild of South Phoenix, and it hurt because I like to win, and we plowed ahead. We did well in our surveys, and then CMS came back to us and told us, no, the state didn't finish all their complaints dating back 3 years before you took over, and they went ahead and they gave us a tag that put us back in a situation where we needed to pass more surveys. So fast forward, and we've done quite well in our surveys, and we're on our path to end special focus. And as you know, the state, the White House is definitely pushing even tighter, capping the amount of deficiencies that you need to have. Recently, after our last survey, we got a call from the Department of Health saying that you guys are the #1 facility that we want to send our residents to in terms of behavioral patients. And that's really, that has to do with team. You have to have a solid team. Now, people say that all the time in nursing homes. You have to have a solid team. Great. What do you have to have in a behavioral type of facility? You have to have programs. You have to have, all of our facilities that we have these types of residents, again, some in different layers. We have a psych NP that is on the ground on a constant basis. We practically have an in-house psych NP now for a regular nursing home. That's a tremendous cost, and yeah, it's not cheap. But on the other hand, look at the other side of the coin. You could really fall if you're in a situation where you're not prepared. And as I said before, it starts in the admission process. To prepare yourself for survey, sometimes in these behavioral facilities, it might take more than the traditional 5 minutes that I've always mandated my administrators. You got to get that answer out in 5 minutes to the hospital. I understand it's not a red light, yellow light, green light in behavioral. Sometimes you got to send your director of nursing out and assess the residents and see, because again, like I said before, if you have a resident that you made a mistake, whether it's before survey or after survey, you shouldn't really consider it as something to hold you back preparing for survey. You should always take residents. I don't care if survey is there or not, but if you're not prepared and your staff can't handle it, that one resident will get you into a host of trouble.
Appreciate that. One of the challenges that we see in some of the states where we have funding is a delay in that funding. And I know, Dr. Kovacs, we see that in Nevada very often, but maybe you can speak to how that impacts the decision-making behind taking an acute behavioral resident.
Yeah, I mean, you take that resident knowing that there's a behavioral program and that you can get this additional reimbursement, but you're taking them, and from the point of admission, you have to have at least 30 days of documentation before you can even submit an application to get that additional revenue. And then sometimes, I'm sure in all states, but Nevada is notorious for getting behind and having their own staffing challenges. So sometimes it takes forever for the applications to be approved or denied. And all that time, a facility has accepted this resident and they're caring for this resident and they're not getting the revenue that they need and the resources they need to care for that resident appropriately. So that is a challenge that we face.
when it comes to sometimes, they make the payments based on a quarterly markup sometimes, and we find ourselves chasing the state for reimbursement. And I'm sorry, Christy, for sometimes bothering you a little bit too much to look for approvals when we're expecting it, and questioning denials, of course. But that really ends up affecting cash flow. It's a real challenge that we face. It's something you need to navigate, and there are plenty of operators out there who don't go the extra mile and push that extra, and they find themselves in situations where cash flow is just a weekly issue. And in this day and age, it's a reality.
Appreciate that. I think there's many positives, and I'd like to focus at the end of the presentation on the positives for caring for this demographic. So I'll start with you, Dr. Conlon.
I think first and foremost, it's just being able to maintain someone in their home, essentially, versus keeping them in an inpatient or acute setting. That's not where people belong. That's not where they're going to have the best care. Being able to have the opportunity to essentially fill a gap in care that I'm seeing as the healthcare system's evolving, and we're all experiencing that, whether it's staff retention, reimbursement, and then also accessibility to services. That's the positive, is being able to welcome these people into your facilities while also having access to the right care that keeps them in that facility.
Yeah, and I would ditto. It's patient outcomes, it's quality of life, and getting to make a difference and seeing patients that have been ping-ponging back and forth from homelessness and instability being taken in and provided with all the care that they need, to where they can become stable and make the nursing home their home where they may reside for the remainder of those days, and seeing an improvement in those outcomes and changing really the lives and the quality of life that these people will have for their remaining days.
Agency, when we took over one of our facilities in Nevada, agency was rampant. And I was wondering why these residents are just going crazy. Like there's just so much instability. And I realized that these residents are calling for it. They're actually screaming for it, that they want stability. That's all they want. They want stability. And if they get the stability, then the nursing home is going to work. Now, how do you get there? You get there with people like BHS. You get there with teammates that are on the floor, that are on the ground, that are there for you. They actually just dealt with a situation over the weekend where they had to get an approval very quickly. I'm talking about like late into the night on a Friday night, and they took care of it, and it was unbelievable. So partnering with the right partner is imperative. And once you do that, once you situate yourself in a place where you feel confident about it, I argue that behavioral themed nursing homes can actually be more stable than a regular nursing home.
Yeah, I think the word that comes to my mind with it, Bill, is just a solution. The more intentional we become as an industry, I think we will find that there is a solution there, and it's been there. I've appreciated the partnership with BHS, and there's other partners out there as well. But one of the things that I've appreciated is the fact that we're in it together to find a solution and to make a difference in the industry and on the national stage, and not just make a buck doing it. And there's a big difference between those two. And I've appreciated the amount of understanding that we've pulled as an organization from BHS and just even the political insights that you guys bring to the table. I think smaller mom and pop operations in your state maybe you have political connections when it comes to creating behavioral add-ons in your state. Maybe you don't, but there's a lot of history, a lot of experience that BHS brought to the table for us, particularly in Idaho. And now, as you're working with the legislature to orchestrate and kind of engineer a program in Washington, it's been refreshing to know that we've got a partner in the game for the right reason.
And I'll tell the operators out there that are not from the West that you saw that graph before, that the Northeast and the Southeast is not hit. Give it a little bit of time. Bill is as ambitious as they come, and him and his team will get there, I promise.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. We have 26 seconds left, so I don't think we're going to have time for questions, but we will be walking around after the panel here. We're happy to take any questions, provide you with our contact information. We really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you to the panelists so much for everything that you do and for participating. I appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your show.